Tēnā koutou te ngata whenua te Iagua, tēnā koutou te mana whenua ko Turubal tēnei, kia ora tātou. Well, this story begins when I was just in my 20s, the only woman member of Parliament in the governing party and chair of the Public Expenditures Committee. So I was introduced to a set of rules. The long title is the United Nations System of National Accounts. But you'll be more familiar with its derivative, a gross domestic product, GDP. And as I began to study this set of rules, which governed all policy making in the country, I understood that it excluded consideration of our extraordinary biosphere, our ecosystems, except when natural resources were being mined, forested, harvested, deleted, exploited, extracted. And unpaid work of all kinds, so voluntary and community work, unpaid productive and service work, reproductive work, lactation, subsistence work, all caring work that was unpaid, and all household work was left out of the equation. Across the world and in Australia, women do the majority of this work. And this accounting framework is a little different from the way we run our households. It has no debit side. So everything which has a market transaction associated, whether the activity is legal or illegal, is great for growth. So war and the production of munitions is fabulous for growth. It sits in the accounting framework alongside orchards. Trafficking in people, trafficking in drugs, they're all fabulous for growth as well. So this particular system is now 60 years old. It began to be written about probably in the 1930s, and Australian Colin Clark was part of those first publications. But it owes most of its history to a pamphlet called The British National Income and How to Pay for the War, written by Keynes and by Richard Stone. And pretty much, not much has changed in the measurement framework of this in these 60 years. But I think it's a really good time to ask ourselves, these days, what does anybody think GDP is measuring? And is it comparable country to country in any way at all? Well, it's very difficult to tell because globalization has come along and our major world multinational companies try to find tax havens where they say, which they say is their home for ownership and production purposes. One of the more nefarious examples of this was in fact the Apple office in Ireland. The Apple office in Ireland did exist, but there was never anybody there. And this was to obviously take advantage of the Irish tax treatment. Well, the European community were onto this, and in 2015, they levied a tax on Apple for $13 billion US dollars in terms of unpaid tax. And that, of course, forced Ireland to be a little bit more honest about the source of some of their GDP, and overnight, Ireland's GDP went up by 26.3%. Now, one of the things that we can think about with Apple, Google, Amazon, Facebook, Netflix is about ownership, because ownership is very important in the GDP, and thinking about, well, who owns this and where are they? So if we took an Australian company, for example, that did most of its production in Taiwan, that was supplemented by widgets from Bangladesh and India, and was then shipped to Canada, what's really interesting is that because ownership stays with the Australian company, the profits come to Australia even though none of the production happened here. So these global production chains also make it really difficult to work out where was value added to this product and in which economy was this value added. Because there's inevitably now double counting. And GDP accrues inside a nation-state boundary. So you've got to keep pretending that you know where the value add is and you know where the ownership is. So that's quite an international game these days. There's another 60 years on problem, which is nobody knows how to distinguish properly between goods and services anymore. If you think about intellectual property products, information technologies, apps, etc. Movies. When are these a good and when are these a service? And across the world, this is another huge argument, which the United Nations Statistical Commission has not solved. They say there's a very low level of compliance these days in terms of the designation of different productive and service points in the GDP, and that they do not expect the conceptual issues to be resolved for a long time. Another thrilling quagmire these days is the treatment of what's called establishments, because 60 years ago, mostly there was one location for productive and service work, and so that was the establishment where productivity took place. Well, every day now people cross a boundary of production. I'll just come back to that boundary of production in a moment, because they might work from home, right, and use household assets, which are, of course, not of any value, to do their paid work inside a particular fixture, a house, which is not an enterprise. People might use their households for Airbnb. People might use their household asset as an Uber taxi. And with all of this crossing of the boundary of production and use of assets that apparently are not supposed to be used in production, again, it's just a mess. Then you can get to the other great issues. I'll just do boundary of production for a moment. When I set out at the beginning, all the things that were not counted in the national accounts, the authors in 1953 established a boundary of production. Why? It's wonderful when you read the encyclopedic tomes that are written on this and what their reasons were. It was a matter of convenience. So the boundary of production excluded all the household work, subsistence, voluntary, community, etc. And of course, I've explained how the environment was treated. I've often thought to myself that if men gave birth and lactated, I imagine the boundary of production would have been not a matter of convenience. Then we get to the next exciting issue, which is consumption. Wikipedia is produced for nothing. And we don't pay anything to consume it, though it's perfectly obvious we might use it in productive or service or educative activities. But is it possible to consume something that is worth nothing? So the flawed data is increasing and increasing, and that's without the ethics and morality of the whole GDP. When I first saw the flaws in this system, I was very interested to know, very interested to think, well, if I want to empower unpaid work and I want to empower environmental assets, maybe I need to attribute a market value. And I am so pleased that a few years later, since I had left Parliament and was no longer co-opted to the kind of power dynamics that operate there, that I realised I did not want to put life-giving forces in the same set of accounts that valued war and military operations. There's a major ethical and moral issue as well. So are there examples of alternatives? Well, Indigenous people have given us examples of alternatives for ages. But the one I wanted to discuss with you today is the one that's come from the OECD, written by the grandsons of the architects of the GDP. It's a bit like that wonderful Monty Python line, and now for something completely similar. So you've got to remember how much economics has colonised words like value and labour, and now they're going to colonise the word called capital, because apparently, as well as financial and economic capital, there is human capital and social capital and environmental capital, and they very quickly substitute words like stocks, resources, and assets across this. You will not be surprised to know that in the financial and economic capital, unpaid work is completely excluded. In the human capital indicators, we all arrive at age 15, work ready for the labour force, and with only the government putting any investment into us. Nobody reproduces human life, nobody lactates, and nobody parents. Then the next thing is that they think they can, the whole use of this word capital, which is really anathema. So they think they can capitalise on everything, work out some cost-benefit analysis on everything. So I thought to myself, well, let's look at the safety indicator. They ask a question in a general social survey. Do you feel safe in your community at night? That's the only question. And they say it's a subjective well-being question. This, of course, it's the only subjective part, of course, because making a decision to exclude the majority of the work on the planet is a clinical, objective, detached decision. And in New Zealand, 78% of men say that they feel safe outside in the community at night, and only 44% of women. And the crazy thing about this is that the only policy outcome, if the numbers of those who don't feel safe increases, is more police. Well, we've been there, done that, and it just doesn't work. And it doesn't follow all the other places where women are unsafe, in their homes, at their work, online. When we think about them trying to monetize ecosystems, Paul tells me there are some folks who come from Tasmania for integrity. So this is for you. Think for a moment about the Tarkine forest in Tasmania. So we've got remnants of Gondwana land, the second largest temperate rainforest left in the world, eucalypt forest, wilderness, frogs, fish, birds, wetlands, moorlands, woodlands, rivers, mountains, cave systems, mammals. Now, the best guesstimates for any cost-benefit analysis with respect to logging or mining are hilarious. The truth is that in the end, the future of the Tarkine will be decided by the ballot box, not by any flashy economic abstractions. But I think that anybody who even thinks that you can do this just hasn't seen enough David Attenborough documentaries. Australians have been making some important contributions to what the alternatives should be for a long time. First of all, for environmental indicators, we don't need to capitalise any of it. We need them to stand alone in their own integrity. It might be impossible for economists to work out trade-offs based on different data sets, but for most of us with common sense, it's not difficult. Duncan Ironmonger and Evelyn Sonius made some really major breakthroughs. They used time use surveys to work out in 1992 that Australians did about 380 million hours of unpaid household work each week, compared with 272 million hours in paid employment. Duncan was able to demonstrate that unpaid work was the single largest sector in Australia's economy, 3 times the value of all mining and mineral extraction, and 10 times the value of all manufacturing. Let me update this to 2017. PricewaterhouseCoopers, using the time use data again, concluded that women undertook 72% of all unpaid work in Australia. There was a change over this period. The single largest sector of Australia's economy is now childcare. The second largest sector of Australia's economy is all the rest of unpaid work. The third largest sector is Australia's largest industry, the financial and services industry, the largest market formal economic activity. And in all of this time use is still not accounted for pregnancy, birth, lactation, mothering, the essence of reproduction. And in Canberra, Julie Smith is the world's leading researcher on breast milk and the national accounts. An infant adds 44 hours per week to unpaid work. Exclusive breastfeeding takes 17 to 20 hours per week. There is no market substitute for breast milk because no alternative is as good. Julie estimates that this food production on an annual basis is worth $2.1 billion a year. I imagine that in Australia, just as in New Zealand, milk from sheep, goats, cows and buffalo are in the national accounts, but not lactation. Measures of Australia's progress was well on the way to an alternative to GDP. And to do this, you need a nationwide time use survey. This was cut by the Liberal coalition government, and I note that the opposition Labor Party at federal level has said that they will reinstate time use. Since there's no key assistance at the moment from central government to look at alternatives, there is one that is cited at the University of Melbourne called the Australian National Development Index. It has a really ambitious program because of the number of community consultations it wants to undertake. Unlike the boys at the OECD, who are sitting there determining, based on their value judgments, what should and should not be included in environmental, social and human capital, the Australian National Development Index team is democratising the debate. It's asking Australians, what contributes the most to your well-being? In their approach, the trade-offs become very visible. We do need fundamental changes to the GDP. The fundamental changes we need must be able to operate in 2050. The most important database any of us can have for really key, targeted, evidence-based policy making is time use to anticipate 2050. And I urge all of you to do all you can to ensure that government delivers that to you on an ongoing basis and fully resourced, so that well-being becomes something meaningful to all people. Thank you.